Very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, the women went to the tomb, bringing the fragrant spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they didn't find the body of Jesus. They didn't know what to make of this. Suddenly, 2 men were standing beside them in gleaming bright clothing. The women were frightened and bowed their faces toward the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He isn't here. He has been raised."
Welcome everybody and happy Easter. And I'm sorry we can't be on the mountain this year or have you with us, but maybe next year. But it's lovely that we're able to join us here on this fantastic Easter day. And it's a really special day for us today because we're delighted to welcome one of our spiritual fathers here at the Aspen Chapel, Cynthia Virgil. Now, Cynthia has a huge history with us here at the chapel and has been influential to the spiritual development of many of us. She won't like me saying this, but Cynthia was recently voted by Watkins Books one of the 100th most spiritually influential people, that's spiritual teachers, activists, and authors and thinkers all over the world. And her new book, Eye of the Heart, has also just been chosen as one of the best spiritual books of 2020 by Spirituality and Practice websites. Cynthia, welcome.
Well, thank you, my dear. And a blessed Easter to you all. I'm looking out here where pews are normally filled and crammed with wiggly children and everybody in their finery. And it's a vaster space. But it's a glorious homecoming. I've gotten to spend the whole of Holy Week with wonderful dear friends, my traveling companions for about a quarter of a century of my life now. And to come back is a real resurrection from the grave for me personally in this season. And I thank you, Nicholas, for the invitation to share the pulpit on Easter and to greet you all in the name of our risen Lord. He is risen. Truly, he is risen indeed. So, Nicholas asked me to maybe share some reflections on what Easter has to say to the world situation. And I think for most of us, when we think about the world situation, the thing immediately on our plate is da-da-da-da, Death Valley. And I think that it's a topic you can't really sidestep. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity for some thoughtful reflection and for perhaps moving away from kind of the kind of cookie cutter, music grinder box kind of Easter things you always say. This is actually our second year of traveling with a pandemic, our second Easter. It was just about a year ago that everything came to a screeching halt. Was it March 18th in 2020 that the unthinkable happened? Ski-Co shut down. And since then, we've had a year on a very steep learning curve, a very sobering one, but a profitable one for those that are willing to really take it on. The big difference, I think, between last year and this was that last year we really thought it was a short haul. We'd put up with this inconvenience, but certainly in 3 months at the latest it would be over. But as it dragged on and it looked like, well, maybe not June, not quite yet July, and oh my God, are we going to be able to open schools in the fall? And you know how it went. And gradually we got the idea that this is long haul. We're all COVID long haulers at this point. And that there was a joke that I heard that God pushed the pause button and sent us all to our rooms. But there's some truth in it, that human beings have gone through a massive reset button this year, where if nothing else, we've been called up short. The pandemic has really caused us to question what is our own part in this? What do we contribute? And it's forced us to kind of cut the frenetic and unconscious pace of our lifestyle and ask ourselves the true questions. What really matters? What's important? What are the values? What have we been doing that's just wastage, that's just busy work? What do we really want to fight for? What holds us together as human beings? What is a bottom line of being a human that's so important that even we have to wade through death to find it. Or is there any such thing? Is death the bottom line? These are all Holy Week questions. This is what the mystery is all about. So we've had time to reflect, and to the extent that human beings have, as people increasingly have seen, become an invasive species in the body of the earth, upsetting crucial balances. It really is a time for some deep soul searching and reflection, and in the light of Holy Week, this is good reflection. So we've had, in other words, a year of Lent, a year of genuine remorse of conscience, soul searching, purification, hopefully, and the search for real values. What makes us enduringly human? So this year, as we face it, it's unfortunately premature to just let the steed of resurrection go galloping to the barn. We're still playing cat and mouse games with this COVID. And although there is a sense that the corner is turned, we're not just going to pack it up and go about business as usual. It's a dialogue. It's a dialogue with reopening our hearts. And in respect for this, I was just reading, I've been running an e-course for the whole of Lent on spirituality on practice, and one woman posted in her comments on the practice circle this marvelous quote from my dear friend and colleague, Brother Wayne Teasdale, who was also a well-loved friend in this valley, and was really the founder of the interspiritual movement, which has so much history here at the chapel. So in his famous book, The Mystic Heart, Wayne wrote this: "Humanity stands at a crossroads between horror and hope. In choosing hope, we must seed a new consciousness, a radically fresh approach to life, drawing its inspiration from perennial spiritual and moral insights and experience. We must recover the shared mystic heart beating at the center of the world's deepest spiritual traditions." And I think that's a wonderful summons. In choosing hope, in choosing new life, we must choose a different kind of consciousness. And Wayne is saying that where we're going to find that consciousness is at the center of our great spiritual traditions. And remember, Wayne is an interspiritual guy, and he's guided by the fact that at the center of all the great traditions, we're basically building a fire around the same truth, the same basic mystic heart. So it's Easter in one of these world's deepest spiritual traditions. And more than that, it's the Paschal Mystery, as it's called, because you can't separate Easter from the parts of the drama that came before it. This is not a one-act play, it's a three-act play. And we have inevitably in this crucifixion, willing death, betrayal, time on the cross, and then resurrection. The whole thing of Jesus' voluntary passage through death into new life, dragging us along on his coattails, if you wish. This is the heart of the Paschal Mystery. This is what we're celebrating. So what truths does this have to contribute to the rebuilding of consciousness in the world, if this is really the task we're summoned to, both by COVID and by our own conscience? Well, I think there are two things I'd like to comment on. One is perhaps more obvious, one is much more right between the eyeballs. So we'll start with the easier one first. Let's work up to it. First of all, obviously, the Paschal Mystery is built around the proximity, the intimate interconnection of life and death. It puts us close this week, particularly if you've done the whole Holy Week journey, to the passage from death to life. We walk it through, we enact it liturgically, we pray it each day as we try to understand death and life Are they really such strangers? Are they really opposite ends, or are they more closely intertwined in something? So, of course, this is very relevant to us. That in the time of pandemic, we've all lived close to the principal players this year. We've all lived close to death. Some of us have lost beloveds. I'll bet everybody who's viewing, listening, is no more than one step removed from someone you knew, someone you loved, who's not there. And we've faced all sorts of other shutdowns and brushes with death. Beloveds dying alone because hospitals were not able to admit you to be at their bedsides. We've faced this. We've had to face our own fear levels, fear around death, fear around sociability. So the turf we're traversing is not unfamiliar. This has been our existential ground this past year. And what the Christian Mystery in Holy Week does is it calls it out for us and allows it to look at it carefully from the eyes of holiness, which I think is good. And I think that, unfortunately, what Christianity is saying, for better and for worse, is exactly the same truth that lies at the heart of all these deepest religious traditions, namely that we proclaim in all spirituality the inconvenient truth that true life, authentic life, free life, real life, life that can give itself to others, begins on the other side of death, not on this side of it. As long as your focus is on outrunning death, end-running death, repressing it, denying it, distracting yourself, you will be chained to two things. First of all, your survival instincts. Your amygdala will run the show. And second, you'll chained to your small self, your ego self, the one that says, "Oh my God, I'm going to die." That one. And we know that both of those two things will die, and they will not rise. This is what all the traditions say. So that what they say is the only way through, if life is what we want, if life is what we want to share, if we want to choose life, we must, in some sense, go through death. That's where the pathway lies. The great desert fathers and mothers had this famous saying, "Sit in your cell and ponder the hour of your death." Morbid, you say, but no, life-giving. So do we mean you have to die? Do you have to actually die, or is it just the fear of death? Well, actually, they're joined. It's like one of those Mobius strip figure eights, that fear of death and death are so related that you can't disentangle them. I believe that every ego act of grabbing, clinging, possessing, demanding, asserting finally traces its roots back to the actual physical fear of dying. If you push far enough, all self-preservation, all self-enhancement in this life is about fear of that end. So it's connected that way. But in another way, the traditions have all made the distinction, whether you're talking Sufis or Buddhists or what, the phrase, "die before you die." And what they're always talking about, frustratingly, in a way, is ego death. When you say somebody's died in this tradition, it always means they've died to their ego. And if they've done this dying still in life, physical death provides no disruption to identity, because you've already discovered what in you lives beyond death, and that something has been found, and it does live beyond death. And as you live out of it now, you live like a true human being and not like a frightened animal. So that's what the traditions say. So in this sense, what we have in Holy Week, in the Paschal Mystery, is an object lesson in how you do it. Jesus models the behavior that leads us through the valley of the shadow of death into life. And it's the behavior that finally doesn't jerk out when faced with its own death, but keeps walking toward that which it loves most. So he models this, and he also sacramentally accompanies us, because nobody says this is easy. In fact, it's a little beyond us. It's a little beyond any of us. You first. And because it's something just beyond what humans can do unaided, our Christian tradition says he is there in some way to walk with you, to hold your hand, to be present with that additional energy boost that you can't find in your own fear. So that's the wager that Christianity lays before us. That we all need this kind of courage, this kind of authentic force, the energetic force that gets released when we're able to move beyond our own fear threshold into an act of genuine compassion or genuine altruism, is a charge of raw energy of love out to the planet. No diminishing it. It changes the atmosphere of the universe. There's a little story that goes right with the Passion, that when Jesus finally dies in forgiving love, the centurion who's set to guard him says, "Oh, what was that? Truly, this man was the Son of God." What happened? I think he caught a whiff of the energy of love flowing out of the force field of the being of this person. So that's the first part, that what Jesus does is give us a role model and a center for the occasion, for the equation of how do you live, how do you die before you die? That's the Paschal Mystery. How do you live out of what you've found after you die? That's the resurrection. And he invites us to dip a toe in the water. So that's the easier one, believe it or not. The harder point, the more between your eyeballs thing that I'd like to suggest is this, that Jesus is not, however, simply a metaphor for personal growth. He's not simply an archetype conveniently given us by Carl Jung or someone to symbolize our full emergence as authentic human beings. Nope. That if you look at what made Christianity go from the start, it was this absolute conviction that something had actually happened, that he had actually risen from the dead, not metaphorically, but in full flesh, and that this act, which quantitatively is not different from a million other political assassinations over the history of the world, that something in this death changed the nature of the world. And you can't deny that this is what the early Christians thought. And when I'm talking about early Christians, I'm talking about to Christians up to about the year 1920, or roughly 2,000 years of Christian culture, believed this absolute literal historicity, that something Jesus did in this action has an objective cosmic truth that changes the nature of things. Well, in liberal progressive circles now, that's not on. And what we've tended to do, since we can't really see how this could be, has been to back off from that claim, relativize it, but it's like just fatally diluting something that the early Christians saw and that actually gave them energy to live and rise. So I think that one of the things that I would really invite all who even loosely are trying on for size the name Christian to try in this coming year is to push a little harder into your own personal reappropriation of how this might be true. Because there's power there that we're just letting leach out, if we can find it rightly. There's lots of help that comes from the esoteric traditions that, the Buddhists the Tibetan Buddhists have a very strong tradition of what they call rainbow bodies. And of reappearances of first-order spiritual teachers, which Jesus certainly was, when they are needed to take physical appearance back on the planet again for causes of service. There's a long history, and I've bumped into that in the Sufi tradition as well. But I don't want to work at it this way by taking you off on a wild esoteric goose chase. I think the more important way to work with this is to suggest that the inner world and the outer world are joined at the hip. We've too long been thinking that religion is about the inner world, and then the outer world runs by its own laws. I'm going to suggest they run by the same, and it's that same sort of Mobius strip figure 8 connecting inner and outer. And that the pandemic gives us a very good way and a very practical way to explore this model of Jesus and this reality of something that happened in a new way. So in Tibetan Buddhism, there is this practice called Tonglen. It's an advanced spiritual practice. You have to have special training to do it. But what you essentially do is to consciously breathe in the toxicity of a situation, of a person. You take on another person's illness, you breathe it into yourself, you hold it in a non-possessive, quiet equanimity, and then breathe out blessing. It's a high energy practice. It's a high stakes practice, but it's a power that I've seen it being applied by Buddhist masters who know it. It's got some torque to it. It definitely does. So all spiritual practices, all spiritual traditions have some version of it. The Christian version of Tonglen is called substituted love. And we see it in Jesus on the cross. If you can imagine him there not as an unwilling victim strung up because a God demanded a sacrifice, that atonement theology we all hate, but in conscious love, taking on and taking into himself the pain, the violence, the anger, the rage, the betrayal, all the things that happened that Holy Week, taking it in, holding them, transforming them in the heart, and breathing out forgiveness, blessing. I sometimes call that cosmic dialysis. As what he was really doing on the cross was in a literal way purifying the toxicity of our collective human sin, of taking it in, purifying it in the only way that sin can be purified. It doesn't get purified by being punished. It gets purified by being reintegrated, loved, and breathed out in blessing. And Jesus is doing this both in a personal way and cosmically, which is why the tradition, I believe, has such a powerful sense that what happened on the cross there, even though it's just another run-of-the-mill martyr's death, has a holographic quality to it that catches the whole thing, that is sacramental for the whole world, that is healing for the whole world, and that permanently establishes in our planetary atmosphere a force field of love that can be tapped into and drawn into as we continue the work of the purification of sins that paves the ground for the holiness of life and the outpouring of love. So that, I think, is what's there. And people have discovered that again and again who've given themselves to that. Well, that's got some real relevance for us right now, doesn't it? I mean, Todd Glenn is supposed to be an advanced spiritual practice. But nowadays, here we live in our world, which we have in sharing our planet with a planet where a virus has now become airborne, where it spreads effortlessly in the atmosphere. We humans have systematically over-agitated, over-inflamed, chemically polluted, and electromagnetically toxified by our greed, by our narcissism, by our curiosity, by our arrogance, by our power-seeking. This is real. This is real. These are not just inward things. Our inner greeds, our inner sin creates an environment which is just very disposed to outer toxicity. And today, what used to be an advanced spiritual practice is for all of us. Breathing is an act of courage. Breathing, this taking in. But my sense is that, and this may be risky, but we are just at the beginning of a healing work. And what we can do as we quietly tiptoe through this corner that may be turning is to take on this work consciously. Whether in your mask or without it, when you're free, when you're safe, when you can, to let yourself be in the presence of Christ on the cross. Breathe in some of the terrible pain that our planet has suffered through our own human intemperance. Breathe out the blessing of this Christ heart that will flow through you. Step up and let's make Easter begin today on Easter in doing the work that will heal and purify and reset our planet on an even ground towards a more sustainable and a more hopeful future. That is the power that I think Easter holds for us this year. It can give us the boost to turn the corner. We believe that love triumphs in all worlds. In our inner world, it is the force of our own liberation. In the outer, it is the courage to admit that our collective human sinfulness, our arrogance, our greed, our curiosity, our restlessness, not to mention the mass psychosis we've all endured in the political scene this past year, has, in some sense, physically toxified our planet. We can do the healing work. We can do the healing work in the name of Christ, in the name of the Holy Resurrection. This is courage. This is the way of the heart. And it is what resurrection faith calls us to this Easter as we turn the corner in the pandemic and move on together in our one planet into new life. Thank you. A blessed Easter.
I know it's different mood, but I have to say that was so lovely. Beautifully played, Heidi. Thank you. Samuel.
From J.G. Bennett's talk on the resurrection delivered at his Sherborne community. Everyone who begins to study and know their own state is well aware that our experience is a constant dying and rebirth. We must not be frightened as we come to see this, although it really is a terrifying thing that we have no power to keep hold of in our own life, that it has to be renewed or given back to us by something that does not come from ourselves. But even when we do see the helplessness with which we fall into oblivion, at that very moment when we are most trying to hold on to ourselves, we must learn to trust that there is something that calls us back and will call us back. And if it calls us back from sleep at night, it will call us back from that other sleep into which we shall enter, the sleep of death.
Thank you, Samuel. Well, Cynthia, I was very interested in just choosing that little passage because when we think of that current world situation, everything that's been going on over the last year, you put those two different things. The first thing you talked about, the idea that we are in that place where maybe we can make a difference and change the direction. And it says here that in that reading, trying to hold on to us, we must learn to trust that there is something that calls us back. And the question I want to start really with is, do you think that, as a planet, we have learnt enough and that we will be called back and that there will be some sort of a change made after this year of pause?
Yes, I do. I had to pause before saying that because it's a tight struggle.
Yeah.
I mean, and there are massive forces of denial working against it. But the Easter message, and particularly as it's reflected through some of the great contemporary mystics like Teilhard de Chardin, that say essentially that God has invested so much in the full emergence of human consciousness and conscious love over the 14.7 billion years, that it's not going to be aborted at this point.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that it won't cut deeper, but that the gene of life, the gene of ultimate triumph is seated deep into this planet, and it will have its way eventually.
Yeah, I'm always struck, when I think of the sweep of history, and you think of the last pandemic over 100 years ago, more people were killed in the flu pandemic of 1918-19 than were killed in the whole of the First World War. And yet when we think back on history, we think of the First World War, we think of prohibition, we think of the crash. The lessons really weren't learned in that pandemic then. And I wonder, whether or not, do you see some signs that the lessons are going to be learned this time? Can you see anything in what's coming?
I mean, I feel like there's a rise in awareness and consciousness. And like what you were saying, Cynthia, in your talk, that invitation to each of us individually and collectively to emulate what Jesus did on the cross. It's so touching that to feel into his robustness and vulnerability and presence and willingness as he was there, that if enough of us are willing to do that, give ourselves to that, then it will bring about this change that we're talking about. That's what I feel, and that I feel so invited to.
Yes.
Yeah.
I loved your second point that you were talking about. It reminded me of, it's not quite the same thing, but when Thor brings down his hammer and there's a great, something is changed suddenly.
Yeah.
You were suggesting that thing, really on the cross, that sort of Thor effect happened with Jesus on the cross. And I think here we are at Easter, and really we can take heart from that, can't we? In that our tradition is that effect. Our tradition is that difference can be made.
Yeah. Well, I really believe that it remains in the atmosphere.
Yes.
And that it was if not a turning point, because that may hold it too tightly, it was at least a contribution into the mix of something that has the potential for accelerating the speed and rate and beauty of the full emergence of love, which for me is identical with the full emergence of consciousness.
Yes. And do you see any particular green shoots that you can point to at the moment? I mean, we've all been watching the news, we've all been seeing the situation, and we've all been seeing people saying, hey, look, there is a pause that's happened here, there is an opportunity. Do you see any particular green shoots that we can hold on to in that?
Well, it may make it a little, it may pull it up to a bit too cheerful level, I know there's green shoots, and you touch them. I would say one of the most powerful green shoots that I've seen is that since arriving in the valley, every conversation I've had with everybody, I swear, is deep and of the heart.
Yes.
And is talking about real things in ways that are much more transparent and vulnerable than I've ever seen before. That people are are less into hiding in the normal. I think there's an opening of a depth capacity. But I sense, I've told the story sometimes, Nicholas, and you may know it, of being of good British stock, that I visited Tintern Abbey right on the eve of the election that put Donald Trump in office, and was drawn into, inexplicably, an experience that finally ended with me full prostrate in the open skies at the foot of what was once the high altar. And this monastery had been smashed in the wake of a random political move, Cromwell's, anti-religious establishment act, and 400 years of profound service in the Trappist tradition, of profound love, wiped out. But as I got myself up off of this green patch where I was lying, I said, you got to get used to this. It could get obliterated in an instant. But look, we're talking to you now and you're listening. Mm. That something carries on from the highest benchmarks of consciousness, of generosity and nobility that each one of us seed. Mm. And I think that what I would say is the real green shoots is that many people are seeding that nowadays, and are seeding it intentionally in love, even knowing they may never live to see the fruits of it. But this gift, this evolutionary gift that we're putting back into the planet out of our own willing hearts, will not return empty.
Do you find that, because you're in a sense on the coalface more than me, in that you do meditation every day with the whole group of people. Have you seen that depth reappearing yourself? Do you resonate with that?
I do. I feel like, and thanks to you, Cynthia, for helping me so much with, to see this. But the call to identify with me and the people that I'm doing this with, to what is mine to give out to the universe. What fragrance is mine to put out there, like that responsibility that we each have to make that difference and to trust that it's making a difference, and also what you were saying about just the divine alchemy that happens inside us when we give ourselves to that. So I don't know, there's just such a deep knowing and trust that in that it's making a difference. It's so compelling.
And we may not, I like the way Cynthia says, we may not see it in our lifetime. That suggests that idea of love, that definition of love which we use here, giving with no expectation of return. Yeah. And we are really giving in our generation with no expectation necessarily of return. But